And so we're going to talk for the next couple of times about 20th century art, and then talk about some contemporary topics that have come up in the culture, that are really relevant to our time. So we start back with, oops, that's not what I want. We start back with art in the 19th century because that's really where 20th century art begins. And so the chapter that you should read in your book is chapter 21. But chapter 21 starts earlier. It starts at the beginning of the 1800s, and you don't have to read the first part. Start in chapter 21 with post-impressionism, because that's where we're going to start talking about 20th century art, or modern art, as it's also called, by talking about impressionism. At post-impressionism. And the reason that we do that is that a lot of what happens in the early 20th century is influenced by these artists that are known as post-impressionist artists. There are two major directions in post-impressionism. There's one direction of artists that are interested in emotion and expression and symbolism within art. And then there's another group of artists that are interested in form, just how do you create art, how do you use shapes and how do you use color and all of those visual elements that we've talked about. We're going to start by talking about form first. And the only artist I'm going to talk about for form is this artist. His name is Paul Cézanne. He lived in the latter half of the century. He worked mainly in the 1880s and 90s and the beginning of the 20th century. And he represents, artists that are very interested in how do you create an art that is as important as art of the past. He made the statement that he wanted to take Impressionism, which is a style just before this post-impressionist style that we're looking at. He wanted to make it as solid and permanent as art of the Renaissance or any earlier period of time. And he felt that there were problems with Impressionism. A lot of these post-impressionists, and they get their name just simply because they're coming after the Impressionist artists that had created art before them. And a lot of these artists felt like all Impressionism was just a bunch of scattered strokes on a canvas. And they felt like any sense of unity and composition, focal point and all those things that we talked about for principles of design, that they'd just sort of been lost. And in fact, in late Impressionism, you almost lose the shapes. You can't see the subject matter anymore. And so the artists that were interested in form in this post-impressionist period were very interested in how can you use that impressionism, those broken brush strokes, and that really bright color that the impressionists had created, but give form back to it. And so Cézanne works on that problem in his work. And here on the right, you're looking at an example of one of Cézanne's works of a bay. He worked in the south of France. He had been to Paris because Paris was the capital of art at that time, so every young artist went to Paris to study. But nobody liked him in Paris. They didn't like his style. They didn't understand his style. And so finally, in frustration, he went home to the south of France and worked for the rest of his life in the south of France, having very little to do with anybody in Paris. And so this is one of the paintings of one of the bays in the south of France that he painted. And he painted these scenes again and again and again. And the reason he did was he was trying to find how do you modernize art? How do you take a traditional scene like this, and this is listed second here on the list. This is during the Baroque period, the 1600s, and it's a very traditional kind of subject matter. It's called The Burial of Phocion. It's about a subject from the Greek classical period of time. And the way that Poussin, this artist, represents the figures, he represents them in togas. The kind of architecture in the background is based upon Greek architecture. So he's creating a very traditional kind of art that's based on the classical past. And so Cezanne says to himself, how can I create something like this, but something that looks modern, something that looks new, that doesn't just look, old. He didn't want to just create something like this. He felt like this was old, this was hundreds of years old, and what was the use of just creating the same kind of thing? He wanted something that was much more modern. And so he created a landscape like you see here with the Bay of Lestock. And there are lots of things that are similar about this landscape that he painted to this. There's an emphasis on geometric sorts of shapes in the buildings that he creates here in the foreground of the work. Poussin also had been very interested in really emphasizing geometric shapes for the buildings that he created here in the work. And so they're similar in that way. Cezanne also understands how light was used, by these artists of the past, and he understands that you can use highlights and shadows to make, a form look three-dimensional. And so here, for example, in this particular building right here, we see him using, a lighter highlight over on this side as if the sun is hitting, from the right side of the composition and hitting this building. And then this side wall of the building is in deeper shadow. So again, he understands, how light has been used in the past by artists in traditional art. But, at the same time, he says to himself, but I want it to look modern. And so one thing that he does is he takes that bright color that the Impressionists had used, and he uses it to describe the bay here with this bright blue, the ochres that he uses here in the buildings and greens. He doesn't return to this really dark brown kind of representation that Poussin had used. This became very traditional in the 1600s to work with these very dark colors like Poussin had done. And so he changes the color. He makes it much brighter. He feels like, if something's blue, paint it blue. Make the people understand that this is the color of the bay. Or, if it's a light blue, then paint it that color. Don't, use all these really dark tones. Make it look like a bright sunny day. And so he begins to change, the way the color is treated. And he also changes the way the buildings are treated too. Because while he's, adopting that geometric sort of shape like Poussin had used here, Poussin had shown more details. We have the columns here in this particular building. And if we could get up a little closer in this painting, if we were standing right in front of it, we would notice that he's tried to show the details of the brick and the stone that these buildings are built out of. And so he's given us lots of detail. He really wants us to believe in the reality of these buildings. Well, Cezanne simplifies that. And so for this building, we have one plane that represents the roof line. We have this side wall, this wall. He really simplifies the detail and doesn't use as much detail. And he also doesn't really show us the individual bricks, that the buildings are made out of. And so in that way, he just emphasizes this cubic sort of shape for the building. And to him, that's enough. To him, he says to himself, everybody will recognize that's a house. I don't have to show every window in the house, every brick that's built this house, every door, So he begins to simplify this. And what he's trying to do with both the brighter color as well as the simplification of building is really make it sort of pop out at us, so that we look immediately and we understand, what this landscape is all about. He was also doing some other things as well that are different from what Poussin is doing here. He is really thinking about how do we perceive things, how do we see things in the landscape. And he knows that, if we're looking at a landscape, we don't just keep our head very still and sort of, like it's clamped in some kind of instrument that won't allow us to change position. He knows that we tend to turn our eyes and turn our head slightly. And it's like we take little snapshots of each area, and then our brain pulls it all together, unifies it, and makes it look like a unified whole. And so what he does in his work is to sort of give us those little glimpses of things from different angles. And he doesn't, like the way we perceive things, he doesn't try to create one unified form within the work. And you see that, for example, to some extent right here in this area, right here. We see this very flat, highlighted wall of the building. And when you first look at it, at least the way I do, and you may not, because everyone, will see it in a slightly different way. When I look at this, I see this as the front of a building, and here's the side wall of the building. Here is the eave of that roof coming back in this way, and so here is the roof that I'm seeing from an angle that's connected here to this line, and this line defines the side wall. But if you just switch your mind, and it's like when we looked at that old woman versus the new woman drawing when we first began to talk about art in this class. If you allow your mind to switch, then you begin to see this brighter highlighted area right here as part of a building that's going in this way. It doesn't quite work if you're still expecting everything to be highlighted from the same side, because we see the highlight on this side of the building, we see a highlight here on this side of the building, so we sort of expect that this highlight must belong to this, but he confuses things slightly, and he says, or are you sure? Is it maybe that this highlighted part right here belongs to this building? The roof lines run together, of these two different buildings. This building looks like it's almost in front of this building back here, and yet the roof lines are the very same level, and they seem to run together. Are we looking at a building as if it's been cut in half and sort of splayed out for us, and we're seeing both sides at once? So what he's done is he's begun to suggest to us, that everything is not as unified and as solid and always seen from only one point of view, the way that Poussin is presenting it here, or the way any Renaissance artist would have presented it. And he's saying that's not really how we see. We see in little bits and pieces, and then our brain adds it together. And so he thinks, and to some extent this is from his understanding of Impressionism before him, he thinks, it's going to appear much more real if I let the people's minds pull it all together, if I let them sort of unify it. And that's what the Impressionists had done also with color. When they broke down all the little bits of color together, they had said, let the people's brains pull all the color together and show, these scenes that we're painting here. So he's doing something similar, but in terms of the form. He wrote many letters to friends. One of his friends was a writer named Émile Zola. And he told Émile Zola one time in a letter, I really doubt that I can ever get nature exactly right. In other words, that I can ever really capture exactly the way people see nature. And that's what he's trying to do here by showing us these shifting sort of images and not giving us just one uniform way of seeing things. He also did some other things that you can see a little bit in the background, but not really very well in this particular work. He began to bleed one area of color or one plane of color into another area. So it begins to be harder to say, here's where this area stops and where another area begins. So what he's doing in trying to create these kinds of things and what influences artists in the future is they're going to look at this and say, hey, this doesn't look exactly like realism as the Renaissance created it. Maybe I can show realism in a different way. Why does it have to be exactly like the Renaissance created it? Why can't I take my own personal point of view and somehow paint things? So he began to, paint scenes like this in the 1880s, and that eventually led him to creating works like this that look even more non-objective, even more shattered than they did in the bay at Lestat. There we still could really tell, here's some buildings, here's some, a bay, here's, trees in a landscape. But by the end of his life, his work that you see here has been so divided up and has become so abstract that it starts to be a little difficult to tell, what we're looking at. The only thing that sort of sets us up to see these areas right here as being buildings are because we saw that earlier one where it was more obvious that they were buildings. But here, is this the roof line of a building that's running off in this way? Why does it suddenly turn in this direction? He allows those lines to sort of flow together. And so it becomes more difficult to tell one separate thing from another separate thing. Here we see two roof lines, so that seems to suggest we're looking at two separate buildings right here. But what's all this behind? What's happening in the background? And then when we get to areas over in here, we don't even see any roof lines anymore. They just become very obvious sort of brush strokes. And he begins to use those brush strokes in a very abstract way. It's almost like he's taking those pieces of colored glass that we talked about for painting and sort of constructing a mosaic, except it's not a mosaic that's really showing us very much representation. We know that there's a mountain here in the background and it's differentiated by color from the sky, so we can sort of make out the mountain. But then when we get down in this area, it becomes very difficult. Which is buildings, which isn't buildings, which are the trees. It's only by color that we can tell them apart, and we don't see anything recognizable really in how he treats the green or how he treats these oranges, these ochre sort of colors in the background. So his work becomes very abstracted towards the end of his life. And again, it's something that will influence 20th century artists because they look at these works and they think, to themselves, look how abstract this is. Why can't I do that too? Or why can't I do something different within my work of art? So this direction in post-impressionism of, trying to find some kind of form, but it doesn't have to be representational form to create a certain unity in the composition, is achieved here in his work just by these different brush strokes. He has sort of a square shape here with brush strokes that are vertical, and then over in the green areas here, more vertical brush strokes. The brush strokes really create the unity, and it has nothing really much to do with being able to recognize anything in this work. So he leads to what we'll see later on in early 20th century art. Then another direction that's an important influence on the 20th century is Van Gogh's work. And here's a self-portrait that he did at about the same time that Cezanne did his self-portrait that I just showed you when we started talking about Cezanne. Van Gogh takes an opposite direction, and he looks at Impressionism, and he says to himself, they were so preoccupied with just painting the color they saw in nature, they forgot all about emotion. They forgot that art can be emotional, that it can have very personal kind of expression within it. And so, again, he takes the brighter palette, the brighter colors that the Impressionists use, but instead of just saying, here's what I see in nature, what he's trying to do with that brighter color is to create something that's very emotional, very expressionistic in the works of art. And we've looked at a couple of his works before. We've looked at the Night Cafe here, and I read you the little writing, the letter that he sent to his brother in which he said what he was trying to do. You know, he said, I was trying to choose colors in order to show that this is a place where people lose their minds. Here's a place where people can commit murder. And so his choices of color are not just because he says, this is what the building looked like. You know, I mean, it did probably have floorboards that were slightly yellow, maybe a little more brown in them than we're seeing here. It probably did have red walls. You know, had a billiard table that probably had green felt on it. I mean, you know, he is trying to stick somewhat close to realism. But he's also saying, but I'm going to choose the exact hues that I use, the exact tones, in order to try and create something very expressionistic. And so, you know, he creates this green, which sort of clashes with the yellow of the floorboards here. And the green is intensified by the red of the walls, you know, because they're complementaries that we talked about. And so he's trying to, you know, use different colors together that he knows will heighten their effect, you know, will make them look much more saturated and much more emotional. And so he, you know, uses color in that way to create personal expression. He's not using color like Cezanne was to create really solid forms. You know, he's not as interested in that. It's more important to create this sense of emotion. And he even does that with very personal sorts of works that he created. This is one of several sunflowers that he created. He said the reason that he created them was that he wanted to hang them in his bedroom because he wanted his bedroom to look bright and sunny. He wanted it to look like stained glass windows of a church. Vincent van Gogh, his father was a Protestant minister, and so all through his life, there are those connections with religion. For a while, he thought he could be a minister, and he tried to go to a place in Holland and work as a minister, but the people didn't like him. He was a little too neurotic for them, and so they didn't like him, and so he failed at that. And so, but that idea of religion being important to him always hangs on. And so with these sunflowers, it's a very personal kind of expression that he's creating. He's not trying to say anything about murder or some big, you know, he's just simply saying, I like yellow. Yellow makes me feel happy. Yellow reminds me of churches and the stained glass windows in churches. You know, yellow seems to be the color of light. You know, that God sends down to us through sunlight. And so it becomes, you know, color becomes a very personal thing for him, and it becomes something that he uses for expression. I also talked about, you know, how he used texture, actual texture of the paint for that expression. And with the sunflowers, he even went a step further. Most of the centers of the sunflowers, particularly the brown ones that you see, such as this one right here, he actually took the pollen from the sunflowers and pressed it into the paint to make it really have that texture of the actual pollen, you know, on, you know, a flower. He felt, I think, in a way like he couldn't ever do it as well as the actual pollen. So he just used the actual pollen. Another work that we've talked about is The Starry Night, and again, it has a lot of that influence of religion within this, because he saw, you know, what he saw in the sky was to him like God's universe, you know, sort of the cosmos that was churning, was so alive, you know, with the movement of the stars and with the movement of the Milky Way. And so again, that was what he was trying to create, was that sense of emotion that he felt when he looked up at a very starry sky. He had a very, you know, disastrous life. He had several love affairs that were disastrous. He failed at several different occupations that he tried. And when he finally became a painter, he moved to the south of France because he knew Cezanne was there, and he admired Cezanne's work very much. And so he went there and he was hoping to create sort of a brotherhood of artists, that all these artists would gather together in the south of France, and they would share how powerful they thought paint was, and how powerful painting was, just art itself was. The only person that ever came down and joined him in the south of France was a man named Paul Gauguin. And unfortunately, they were just exact opposites in terms of personality. Vincent, I think because of just his instability emotionally, was very sensitive, was very easily upset. And people have suggested, doctors like to write about Vincent van Gogh, and they've suggested several things about what might have been wrong with him, why he ended up in a hospital. And eventually he shot himself. He committed suicide. And Van Gogh, on the other hand, was very confident of himself. He was very egotistical. He really believed that the kind of art that he was creating would save the world. It was going to renew art. It was going to move art in a whole different direction. And so he was just, opposite in personality from Vincent van Gogh. And so they didn't get along well at all when Paul Gauguin went to the South to be with Vincent. And some scholars think that he actually didn't go because he wanted to. It's thought that Vincent's brother probably said, I'll provide you with paint, and I'll provide you with all the canvas you need if you'll just go and stay with Vincent, so that Vincent can have this brotherhood that he wanted to create. Well, it didn't work out well. They fought all the time. Eventually, Gauguin made fun of Vincent. Vincent tended to pick women that weren't the best women for him. And Vincent had fallen in love with a prostitute in the south of France. And so Gauguin, in an argument that they had at one point, told Vincent that he had had sex with the prostitute that Vincent was in love with. And it upset Vincent so much he cut off a part of his ear and sent it to the woman. So, they were very different sorts of people. Paul Gauguin is another artist that creates art in this more expressionistic trend that occurs in the post-impressionist period. He had been a stockbroker. He had worked in a bank. He had married a wealthy woman. He was a father. And he drew and painted for relaxation at first. He was sort of what's called a Sunday painter. And he began to have some success. People began to accept his paintings in exhibitions, and so he decided that he was a great painter. And he quit his jobs. He took his wife and the children back to her father in Scandinavia. And he tried to live there for a while with his wife's family, but they sort of pushed him out. He wasn't making any money, and they thought he was crazy for wanting to be a painter. And so he finally left his family in Scandinavia, and he moved back to Paris. And he began to create works in which he tried to create symbolism. His art is more symbolic than Vincent's. Vincent's symbolism is very personal, and so it's more like an emotional reaction that Vincent is trying to create. Gauguin actually tries to take symbolism of the culture and use it in a new sort of way. He believed that French culture was decadent. He believed that it had become very corrupt. And so he decided that the thing to do was to leave Paris, move off into, the back country of France at that time, which was Brittany. Brittany is on the coast of France. It's sort of southwest of Paris. And he thought that there he would find much more simple people, people that weren't so contaminated by civilization. And at this time, they did tend to be more provincial. They still wore traditional sorts of costumes, and you see their costumes here and these very elaborate sort of bonnets that the women wore. And they were very superstitious people, and so he thought, I'll find a much purer kind of society if I go to Brittany rather than staying in Paris. And so this is one of the works that he painted after he'd gone to Brittany. And it's called The Vision After the Sermon. And what he's trying to represent is not some actual thing that they see as they walk out of church, but rather he's trying to show what's in their minds, that they've had this sermon given to them in church, apparently about Jacob wrestling with an angel. It's a story from the Old Testament. And as they come out of church, it's so real to them, this description that's been made, that it's almost as if they're seeing it happen. And so we see these women coming out of church with very prayerful sorts of gestures. Their hands are in prayer types of gestures. And across this trunk of a tree, it's as if they see this angel wrestling with Jacob. But he's trying to tell us that it's not actually happening. It's not really there. This is all in their minds. And so the way that he decides to do it is by showing this very red field. Instead of showing browns or greens, what the local colors, we've talked about that we expect to see in a field, he paints it all red. And he does that, to tell us this is in their minds. This is not natural. This is not just some scene that they're seeing. And so in that way, he's trying to say, I'm creating a symbolism, a symbolic art here. I'm not just painting a natural sort of scene that's happened. Eventually, he became disillusioned with Brittany. He felt like the people in Brittany were still too civilized. They were too influenced by things that were happening in Paris and, in more developed, sophisticated cultures. And so he eventually went to Tahiti. And he lived most of the rest of his life in the Polynesian Islands, somewhere in the South Pacific. He thought, again, that he would find much more primitive sorts of people in Tahiti. And that's what he was looking for. That's why he decided to go there. But when he arrived there, he found Tahiti at this time was a French colony. And when he got there, he found that in the cities, they were French. They had, they wore the same clothing that people wore in Paris. They, had the same religion. They acted, the same way that the people in Paris were. And so he was very disappointed at first that he didn't find this primitive people that he was looking for. But eventually he went up into the mountains of Tahiti, and he did find more primitive people there that still held on to a lot of superstitions. And so he began to paint them. This is one of his early works that he did, and actually this is sort of a transitional work because it's not just a Tahitian story that he's presenting here. Actually, what he's done is he's taken a European story. This woman represents the Virgin Mary, and this is the Christ child sitting on her shoulder. And these are the two handmaidens that are mentioned as being present at the birth of Jesus. And it's a little hard to tell, but you can see the white here. He sort of blends in with the background. This is an angel. This is a figure, this white skirt that you see, and then it goes up to here. Here's the head and the black hair of this angel, and his wing is cut off by the edge here of this slide. We're not seeing the whole painting. And so what he's done is he's taken European ideas, European religion, and just grafted it on to Tahitian ideas. He's made the Virgin Mary look like she is from Tahiti. She's dressed in a sarong, the kind of clothing that the women wore in Tahiti, the more native women wore in Tahiti at the time. They just sort of wrapped around their bodies. Many of them were very brightly decorated. They would be bright, colors, and then they'd have big floral designs on them. So in other words, he's just cast the Virgin Mary as being, this Tahitian woman. He's made, she's carrying the Christ child on her shoulder, a way that Tahitian women often carry their babies. And so again, he's putting that Tahitian idea onto this. He shows these two handmaidens, or, they're like midwives that were supposed to be present at the birth of Jesus. He's given them sarongs also. Also, he's shown them, bare above the waist, their upper torso, and of course that wouldn't have happened in traditional European sort of scenes. But this was his sort of vision of what he was going to find when he went to Tahiti. All the women were going to run around bare-breasted and be very voluptuous looking, and he was so disappointed, when he went and he found they were dressing like, people in Paris. And so he's tried, to turn a European story into something, that is Tahitian, and at this point he hasn't really accomplished it very well. In his later works, he actually does better with it. He made several trips back to Paris in order to sell these works that he was creating in Tahiti so that he would have money to go back. Eventually, he died in Tahiti, probably of syphilis, from the many mistresses that he had in Tahiti. So his art is a more symbolic sort of art, but he's trying to reject, everything that is European. He's trying to find some new source for art. It's as if he's saying European art is dead. It's useless. It's been repeated and repeated and repeated. There's nothing new about it. How are you going to express anything new if you use it? The one thing that he's really given credit for doing, I can show you better with this work. He begins to suggest to artists that color does not have to be representational at all. If you want to show ground as red, show it. If you want to show a tree as purple, show it. He begins to free color from any description of forms. And so in the 20th century, that's going to lead artists to thinking that they can use color in whatever way they want to. So we have Cezanne, who's beginning to break form apart and beginning to say you can do anything you want with the forms, with the shapes of things. And then we have Gauguin, who's saying you can do the same thing with color. You want color to serve some other purpose than representation? Fine, do it. And actually, he said at the end of his life, in a letter that he sent to his wife, I always find it rather interesting that even though he left her with her family in Scandinavia, he kept writing her letters, and he would describe his mistresses to her. And he said, but in one of his letters, he did say to her, people don't owe me anything. It doesn't bother me that they don't understand my art, they don't like my art. But artists do owe me something because I've freed color, and now they can use it in any way that they want to. A couple of other artists that are working in this late 19th century period of time that will be an influence include Henri Rousseau, and you see one of his works right here. He was a tax collector, and like Gauguin, he began to paint on Sundays, as just a hobby. And he received some encouragement from some of the younger artists that were in Paris, and so eventually he took his pension and he began to paint full-time. And he will, receive praise from artists. For example, Picasso, later on in the early 20th century, actually gave a banquet for Henri Rousseau to celebrate him, for what he had done. His influence is mainly in opening up the imagination, and telling young artists of the 20th century, anything you imagine, you can paint. You don't have to paint something that is religious or that's historical. If it's in your mind, if it's a fantasy, paint it if you want to. And he did that by creating works such as this, The Sleeping Gypsy. He always explained his works as being things that he had actually seen, but we don't really think that was so. When people have researched and studied his work, we've found out that often his images came from something else than what he actually explained. And so, for example, we see the Sleeping Gypsy. He said he had seen a gypsy dressed in a multicolored coat like this. In doing research, an art historian found out that at this time there were little dolls that were sold in Paris that had this kind of multicolored coat that you're seeing here. And so many art historians today think that he probably took that doll and copied it, painted it, and turned it into a gypsy, that it wasn't really a gypsy, doll that was being sold in Paris. It doesn't really matter. The idea is he's using whatever stimulus, whatever influence in the culture he wants, and he's fabricating a story here. And so we see this gypsy who is supposed to be sleeping with his mandolin beside him, and some lion has apparently come up out of where, nowhere, who we don't know, and is sniffing him. It's also been suggested that the lion may possibly have been a stuffed toy that was available, to buy for children at this time too. His art is called naive art because he was a self-taught artist. He never took any classes. He simply studied art that he saw in exhibits and in museums and tried to understand the kind of techniques that were being used. And then he would go home and he would try to paint those scenes. And you can see in the way that he treats the gypsy particularly that he doesn't understand entirely what he's doing. This little gypsy here doesn't really look like he's lying down. His title, The Sleeping Gypsy, suggests that he's sleeping. But he really looks very stiff. We could almost tilt him up and he would stand perfectly. So he doesn't understand entirely how to position the body of this gypsy so it looks like it's lying down, how to create foreshortening so that it looks like it's lying in depth. It looks more like he's just sort of stiff, lying down, and then been tilted to his side slightly so that we can see him. And the lion also looks like he's standing on this little narrow ridge of land instead of looking like he's a part of the land, like he's standing in the ground. He looks like he's standing on the edge of it. So, there are little discrepancies in his style that indicate that he's probably self-taught. And we do know that he went to an artist one time, and a teacher of art, and asked him about taking lessons from him. And the teacher looked at his style, and the teacher told him, you have a style. You definitely have a particular style. I'll ruin it if I teach you. If you try to do the things that I would tell you to do, it'll ruin the whole effect. Because you really get, almost a magical sort of effect in all the crystal clear sort of treatment that he gives here of the background mountains and, of the details of the gypsy and all the ringlets in the mane of the lion. This teacher understood that, he really had something here that was different from everybody else. And he'd lose it if he tried to study art. And so that's why he's called a naive artist. We could call him a primitive artist, but I don't like that term. That always suggests that somehow they're unskilled if they're primitive. There isn't a really good thing to call him. We've talked about him in relationship to outsider art at the beginning when we were talking about the ways that artists are trained. And maybe that might be a better way of referring to this work, would be to call him outsider art, meaning he's not been trained, in a traditional kind of school system. But naive is another name that's often been given to him. Another artist working at this time that will also contribute to the 20th century is a man named Edvard Munch. He came from Norway. This, again, is a self-portrait of him, and I think his self-portrait sort of suggests something about his personality. He calls it self-portrait with skeletal arms, and here are the arms down here, as if, he's lost all the flesh off of his arms. He's resting his arms on the bottom here of the work. He's the first modern artist that really studies personality and psychology, particularly psychology that neuroses, things in conflict, where there's some deep inner problem. There certainly was a problem with Vincent, but Vincent van Gogh really didn't study, how it was affecting him. He was looking still outwards and looking at the world and trying to express his reactions to the world. But Edvard Munch paints what's happening to him inside. So he's the first artist to really deal with the inner personality of a person. He came from a very neurotic background. It's no wonder that he became rather neurotic. His father was a religious fanatic, was always telling the children they were going to hell because of things they did. His mother died of tuberculosis. His sister died of tuberculosis. He had other sisters with alcoholic problems and other types of problems. And he himself was an alcoholic. And so, he didn't deal, obviously, with life very well, and he didn't deal well with the loss of loved ones very well. His concerns, become, how we deal with the world. And he feels, and he made the statement one time, we're alone in the world. Even though we have lots of people around us, when it really comes down to it, we're alone. We have to deal with the world by ourselves, with very little help from anybody else. And so he eventually comes up with several different subject matter that he explores in his work. One of them is the urban setting, the modern city. And modern cities were just beginning to develop. They were beginning to grow in population. Once the Industrial Revolution takes place, a lot of people begin to move into the cities. And that happened all the way through the 19th century. And so by the end of the 19th century, artists were beginning to be aware of the problems of these big cities, that were growing in population. And he was one of the artists that began to try to express those problems in society. So he painted this painting that you see here, which is an evening on Karl Johan Street, which is a scene from Norway. And you see all the people walking down, this very exaggerated sort of perspective of this road. And they don't seem to be really relating to each other. They're all sort of staring straight ahead, wide-eyed. They look almost, in some cases, like this man right here. It looks like a skeleton almost. And what he's trying to express here within this work is the idea that people in big cities often don't communicate with each other. When you're living in a little town, you know everybody. You know pretty much what everybody thinks about things. There's a similarity of thought but when you get to the big city, you don't know what everyone's thinking. They've come from many different areas. And so you're a little more reluctant, to be friendly to them because you don't know. Are they going to attack you? Are they going to disagree with you about things? And so you tend to sort of close in and you tend to become more isolated. And so he was trying to express that by the way all these figures, seem to be walking down the street, not looking at each other, not communicating with each other, just sort of staring straight ahead. And they almost have a frightened sort of look on their face, the way their eyes are, so wide open here in their expression. So he began, this is one of the subjects that he was very interested in, how do people react to each other in an urban sort of setting? Then the other big subject matter for him had to do with women and sex. He had, like Vincent van Gogh, a lot of disastrous love affairs. Things never seemed to work out well for him. Of course, I think maybe part of the reason was because of his own attitudes that he had towards women. And in this work, he really expresses all of those attitudes in one work. He believed that young girls, were very pure, very virginal, and so he represents, this girl in a white dress. She looks fairly attractive in the way that he represents her face. And he believed, that young girls were very innocent. He'd grown up with sisters, remember, and so he had seen, that change that took place in them when they moved, from being young to going through puberty. He believed that when women got older, they became like vampires, sucking the blood out of the men that they had relationships with. And so here, this woman represents that middle stage of a woman's life. She's dressed in red. And at this time, red was the color of prostitutes. In Paris, if a woman wore red shoes, it was advertising, I'm a prostitute. Sometimes they wore red garments. It wasn't just the red light, that you hear about. It was the actual, the only ones that would wear red on a public street in those days were the prostitutes. So he's taking that red color in order to indicate, this is a fully sexually aware woman that we're looking at. And notice how her gown looks like it's beginning to creep around this man that she's dancing with. And actually, in other works that he does, he shows women kissing men, and it almost looks like they're sinking fangs into the men's necks. And also look at how he's treated her head. Now she has these big black circles around her eyes, as if her terrible life that she's lived is distorting her, making her look really horrible and ugly. And so this sort of represents, what he thinks happens to women as they grow older. And I think, with that sort of attitude, no wonder he had problems with women. I'm sure he didn't trust them. He was probably always thinking they were going to do something to him, somehow emasculate him or something. And then finally, he shows the woman in old age, in black, to represent, symbolize death, that's coming to her, looking much more haggard in her face, than this beautiful young woman that she apparently has started out looking like. And this, again, to him would represent, this is what happens to women after all of this vampirish sort of activity that they've taken part in when they're younger. So he begins to he explores sex in a new sort of way. In the past, in the Renaissance period, and in the periods that followed the Renaissance, when women were represented, and mistresses would sometimes be represented, but they were always represented these very voluptuous, very beautiful women that were very desirable. And now he's sort of taking sex and he's giving it a very modern interpretation. He's saying sex can be really neurotic, can be really weird kind of sex. So in a way, he's one of the first that begins to deal with a very modern interest in sex, in his paintings. One of his other works that he creates, and this really does sort of represent this inner expression that he's trying to get out, is this work. It's a very famous work. called The Cry. Sometimes you see it called The Scream, and so both titles are useful for talking about this work. He described in a letter why he created this work. He said that one night, in walking home late at night, he looked out over the fjords. Those are like the river valleys in Norway. And he said that it was like he looked at nature and it was like it was screaming at him. And so he's trying to find some way to show that scream of nature. And he thinks to himself, if I just show, nature, the blood red sort of sky that we're seeing here, I'm not sure they'll get across that, the idea that I'm trying to show. And so he decides, well, the way to do it is I will take a human being's face and I will show that human being screaming. And so then it's as if, the scream of that human being is sort of reverberating out, into nature and causing nature to sort of scream or echo, that sort of scream. And so again, it was his way of trying to show some inner qualities, his inner reaction to nature that he saw. And notice that these two people behind here, they're not reacting at all. It's as if they don't hear it. And so what he's trying to say, it's all in my mind. It's all inside of me, this scream that I heard in nature. So he, advances art, and he's going to influence the 20th century in that he begins to adopt some very modern sort of themes. And remember, about this period of time is when Freud is writing his interpretations of dreams and writing about the psychology of human beings. And so it's something that was very common in the culture at this time. People were beginning to talk about this inner life that human beings had. And he's trying to find some way to show that, to express that in a visual sort of image. And so these artists of the post-impressionist period, are beginning to develop things that are going to influence 20th century artists that begin to develop. One of the first styles that develops is called Fauvism, and it is an expressionistic style. So it's very much influenced by these artists that were interested in finding some way of expressing emotions in art. We've looked at this artist before. This is Henri Matisse, and he was really the foremost artist of this style of Fauvism. And this is a painting of his wife, Madame Matisse with the green stripe that we've talked about. This is another painting of her also. And in both cases, in both of these works, he's choosing colors not just because they represent what she looks like, but rather how they can represent emotions, how he can create expression in them. We also talked about that it's not just that the green stripe's there for expression, it's also for compositional reasons. It's his way of balancing these big areas of color that are behind her head and making her head, be the most important focal point in the work. But the green certainly, when people see it in this painting, they respond to it immediately. And, usually with the question, why? Why would he paint a green stripe down the center of this woman's face? So he is using it in a very arbitrary way. He's taking that idea from Gauguin that you can use color any way you want. If you want to use it for expression, Vincent van Gogh had said, use it for expression. So had Munch. And so he's responding to these earlier expressionistic artists who have said color doesn't have to just describe things. It can be for expression. It can also be for composition. And he's also influenced by Cézanne and his compositional use of color, making things define three-dimensional forms. And making things look unified in the work. So he paints these two. Fauvism is first of all known for using these clashing expressionistic sorts of colors. It also got its name from the obvious brushstrokes that you can see here in these works. When when a critic first saw this work in an exhibit, the critic looked at it and said, well, they're painting like wild beasts. They don't even look like they know how to paint correctly. Look at all those brushstrokes. Look at those terrible colors they've chosen to use. And so this critic gave them the name of fauves. Fauves means wild beast in French. And so that stuck as the name for their style. But they were anything but, wild beasts. They were very proper Frenchmen at this time. Matisse, for example, we have grocery lists that he used, that he sent off to order food. He ordered lots of wine. He had a maid that worked for him. I mean, they were living very proper, middle-class sorts of lives. They weren't bohemian artists, some crazy sort of artists living in a garret somewhere. They were very respectable middle-class artists. So the name of fauve isn't really very correct, but it's stuck and has been used ever since to define the kind of style that they created, this very expressionistic sort of use of brushstroke and of painting. Another work that he created is this work, and again, this particularly shows the influence of Gauguin's work on him. How he is making a choice to use yellow here for the ground in this painting because he wants to use yellow. It doesn't have anything to do with what nature looks like. He has just decided this is what I want to use. And, it changes from the yellow right here into these red areas and orange areas. What he's probably trying to do is saying, this is an area of sunlight, and it bleaches out all the color. And so instead of just painting it, looking very sort of pale green or pale brown, I'm just going to paint it bright yellow like the sunlight would be. And so these areas of red are probably the shadows. But, he's using it very arbitrarily now. And as a result, it really does show that influence of Gauguin on his art. He named this work The Joy of Life. And it is as if he's saying, here's what the perfect sort of life would be. Nude women lying around on the ground for men to look at and admire, dancing together that's what's happening here, a group of nude women sort of dancing in a circle in the background. It's as if he's saying, what would be the perfect, thing that I would like in my life? What would make me happiest? And it's as if he's saying, using bright colors and showing nude women. That's what will make me happy. And so that's what he paints. So again, it doesn't have anything to do really with painting something he sees. It's arbitrary choices he's making of color, of what figures he's putting into the composition. They don't relate in terms of size. This is, the size is much smaller here to suggest that they're back in space. But he's really not that interested in the idea of perspective now, which we've talked about. He's just not interested in naturalism anymore in creating this particular work. Another expressionistic style that develops from the influences of Gauguin and Van Gogh and Munch is German Expressionism. German Expressionism is all, and I've meant to mention, Fauvism really appears around 1905. At the same time that it appears in France, in Germany, some other expressionistic groups are developing. And the first group that develops in 1905 is called Die Brücke, which means the bridge in German. And it developed at about the same time independently. They didn't know what was happening in Fauvism, but they were studying the same artists. They were studying Gauguin and Vincent van Gogh's work and Munch's work. And so they were coming up with their brand of expressionism. There's actually two groups of them that I'm going to show you. The earliest group is the bridge, and then a later group that develops is the Blue Rider. And this is really, in a way, the more important group. The bridge group was all male. Women were not considered significant enough to belong to their group. And I've listed, they were mostly German artists, and I've listed a group of them here. They invited Munch to become a member of their group, and he did exhibit in some of their exhibits, but he never really thought of himself as being a part of this particular group. Here's the kind of work that this bridge group creates. First of all, they are influenced by Munch's interest in city life, and these German expressionists are also very interested in expressing city life. And so we see, some women, we see a much more crowded sort of scene of a group of people coming towards us and another group of people moving away from us. Again, they tend to not be relating to each other. So maybe that was influenced a little bit by Munch, or maybe it's just their ideas, that they look at modern life and they say, yeah, everybody's so isolated. They use color in arbitrary ways. For example, here's a green face on this woman. It's not just naturalistic color. Again, they're choosing color, based upon the kind of expression that they want to create. They simplify forms, just as we saw with Cézanne's sort of work, but it's much more representational than Cézanne's sort of work is. Another example of another artist is this artist. They are like Van Gogh in that they wanted to create a brotherhood too, and they actually had a membership card that the members of this group carried around with them that said they were a part of the bridge group. And so here is one of the founders of the group, Schmidt-Rottluff, and his depiction of a religious scene. This is supposed to represent the Pharisees, who were one of the Jewish groups at the time that Jesus was crucified. And he's simplified their faces very much. He's created all these sort of jagged lines to try and convey some of the expression in the work. The color looks non-objective, the blue of the beards against the red sort of cheeks. So again, he's trying to create a very expressionistic sort of work that's based upon Van Gogh's ideas and some of Munch's sort of ideas. Another artist that belonged to the group is this artist, Emil Nolde, and this is part of an altarpiece that he created. And this was a central scene showing you a crucifixion. And again, the body is yellow, the face is yellow. This is Mary Magdalene standing right here. We know that because of her red hair. She's always depicted as having red hair. And she has this yellow face with green sort of shadows, very non-objective, arbitrary sorts of choices of color. And he's making the color choices in order to try and create expression, to make us react really strongly to this. Looking at Jesus and his yellow skin and the green shadows of his face. He's really trying to express this crucifixion in terms of color, not just in terms of what the subject matter is of the work. So the bridge group, keep working with traditional kinds of subjects and with representation, although they choose, to use color in very arbitrary sort of ways, and they distort the figures a lot in order to create this expression. This figure right here in white is supposed to be the Virgin Mary. It's represented here. The other group, the Blue Rider group as they're called, are artists that go farther than the bridge. They eventually create a non-objective sort of art. And this is just some of the artists that were a part of their group. They weren't a brotherhood. They didn't have membership cards that they carried around. They were very international. Vasily Kandinsky was from Russia. Franz Marc was a German. Paul Klee was from Switzerland. Lionel Feniger was from the United States. So it was a much more international sort of group, but they came together in Germany and worked in the same city, so they influenced each other. Vasily Kandinsky was the head of the group, and he's probably the most important of them. And so I'm just going to show you a few examples of his work, and not really going to show you the work by the other group, or the other artists in this group. This shows his early style that he begins to develop around 1908, and it's really Fauvism. It's really developed on that idea of using arbitrary color, very bright, contrasting color, very apparent sort of brushstrokes, but it looks fairly naturalistic. You have blue sort of shadows, dappled sort of yellow for the light that's coming through the trees. So while it's changed, it still looks naturalistic. Eventually, he develops into this style, and this is called The Garden, and it's based upon an event that occurred that led him into what he develops later. He had painted this work, and he went out to take a walk, and while he was gone, his maid came in to clean his room. And when he returned, he saw this on his easel. She had turned the painting upside down. And he said he didn't recognize it at first. He looked at it and he thought, well, who did that? Who painted that? That's not mine. I didn't paint that. And then he realized that she had turned it upside down. And he said that this event was very important because it suggested to him, hey, it doesn't have to be representational at all. It can just be areas of color, with nothing recognizable at all in it, because he didn't really recognize this as being that garden scene that he had created. Okay, we'll finish talking about him next time.